Welcome to Juniper Learning Bytes. My name is Zach Gibbs, and I'm a content developer in education services within Juniper Networks. And today we will be discussing the Security Director Variable Objects Learning Byte. Okay, so to begin, let's talk about what variable objects actually are. Well, first, they are polymorphic objects, and these objects represent addresses or zones. That might seem a little confusing. So to go into a little more detail about that, these polymorphic objects or variable objects allow you to reference different values using the same object in firewall policies. So what does that mean? Well, this next sub-bullet helps clarify that a little more. For example, you only have to specify one rule to accommodate multiple devices, such as you might have one device that requires an address for back-end internal servers, and you might have one device that requires an address for local users. And so what we can do with these variable objects is we can specify a context for one device and then say use the back-end internal server's addresses, or address prefix or whatever, and then we could specify another context in that same variable object that says for this other device specify or use an address that can be used for the local users. And so it allows you to create a single object that you can reference just once in a firewall rule that could mean a multitude of different things depending on which device that policy is being pushed to. So to help you understand that a little more, I'm sure that seems very abstract at this point, but to help understand that more, we're going to have an example here, and we're going to jump into the GUI and show you how that works. But in this example, I want to point out a few things before we jump into the GUI. First, we have three different devices. We have branch 1, branch 2, and the HQ device. And with each of those devices, we have a connected user network. With branch 1, it's 10.10.13.0/24. Branch 2, 10.10.11.0/24. The HQ, 10.10.12.0/24. And so you can see with that we have different local users connected to each device there. And then we have what we're trying to do here with that bullet. We want to create one firewall rule that permits only the specific traffic for the host that the device is connected to. That might seem a little cryptic, but basically what we're trying to do is we're going to create one firewall rule that if we push that rule to branch 1 device, it's going to permit the traffic for the 10.10.13.0/24 network. And we're not going to permit anything else. So we're not in that rule, when we push it to branch 1, we're not going to have the prefix for the hosts that are part of the HQ device, the 10.10.12.0 prefix, or for the branch 2 device, the 10.10.11.0/24 prefix. We're not going to have those prefixes in the firewall rule for branch 1. We're just going to have the 10.13.0/24 prefix. And then for the HQ device, when we push that firewall rule to the HQ device, we're going to have in that actual rule that says, permit 10.10.12.0/24 hosts in that range, and we're not going to push anything else in that rule. We're not going to say that we permit hosts from the branch 1 device or the branch 2 device, same thing that we're doing for branch 1 here, except that we're pushing only that specific 10.10.12.0 address. And the same thing for branch 2. We're only going to push a firewall rule that has the 10.10.11.0/24 prefix specified in it, as an address book object, that is, in the CLI. And so just keep that in mind is, we don't want to be pushing extra stuff to each device because that could represent a security flaw or a security hole, and we're only going to do this with one actual firewall policy rule. And 3 devices may not seem like enough to justify using a variable object. However, imagine if you had hundreds or thousands of devices. Using variable objects could be a huge shortcut. So just keep that in mind as we go through this. So let's go ahead and jump to the GUI to get right into this, to show you how this is done. Alright, here is the GUI. You can see we're in Security Director here. And let's just go ahead and jump to the Object Builder workspace, and then we have the Variables task that allows us to create different variables. You can see it's empty by default. Click the Create Variable Definition button, and we're going to name this. We're going to name this just FW internal var for variable. And then you have two different options. You have type address, type zone. And with address, we're going to reference an address object that we're going to use when pushing out or using this variable. With zone, it would be a zone object. So we're going to use address here. And then we have something called the default address. And I'm going to hold off on talking about the default address field until we create some context values. That'll make much more sense. So we create a new context value, and we have to click the context value field to specify what we want for a context value. And we're given the devices that we can use. We're going to start off with branch 1 for this first context value, and we're going to select the address of branch 1 host. Now this branch 1 host address object was created earlier. It's just the prefix for that branch 1 host, that 10.10.13.0/24. That's something that was created beforehand to save some time. And then we're going to select a new context value, branch 2, select OK, then select an address of branch 2 hosts. Then we're going to add a third context value, HQ. And with this, something to point out is you could pull over multiple context values here as well, if those multiple context values are going to be using the same address object. But here, each context value, so each device, is not using the same address object, so we're not doing that. And then we're going to select HQ hosts for the address. And again, that's the prefix for the host connected to the HQ device. And that's it. Click Create. Oh, first of all, we do need to talk about the default address. Now, the default address is what happens. Say we have a firewall policy that has these three devices, HQ, branch 2, and branch 1, and we have a firewall policy that has HQ, branch 1, branch 2, and an additional device. So say like a branch 3 device, but this variable only specifies 3 different context values. Does not include anything about the branch 3 device. Well, what happens if we have a firewall policy that does include the branch 3 device, but we don't have the context value for branch 3, even though there is no branch 3, that's just hypothetical, then whatever is specified in the actual default address is what's going to be pushed to that other device that we don't have a context value for. So the default address field is for any device that is a part of the firewall policy that doesn't have a context value specified. And so for this, we're going to set that to any IPv4, and we'll do an example here shortly that shows you what that actually does. Okay, click the Create button. That creates our new variable objects. Then let's go to Firewall Policies, and let's use this. Okay, let's create a new firewall policy. Let's just name this just fw-var. So since we're doing var, we're just going to, our variables, we're just going to specify global policy, and we're going to pull across all 3 devices. And then let's click the Create button. It's kind of hard to see here down at the bottom of the screen. The resolution's cutting it off, but that button does say Create. We created the firewall policy, the fw-var. Then let's lock it. You always have to lock firewall policies. And let's create a single rule. So in this rule, we're not specifying a zone right now. We're just specifying the source address. So we're basically going to say the source address. We're going to specify the variable fw-int-var variable. Click OK, and that's added to the source address field. We're going to leave the destination address at any and set the action to permit. And so then we're going to save that rule, and then we're going to go to publish it and take a look at what happens when we're about to publish it. We can view the configuration from here. So let's view branch 1 to begin with. We're viewing the configuration for branch 1, and we can see in here a few things we want to point out. Notice that for the global address book that's going to be specified in the CLI, we have the branch 1 host address object. That's what we specified with that variable. That when we specified that variable object, we specified the context of the branch 1 device, and the address object was the branch 1 host. We're specifying that address object, which is 10.10.13.0/24. And remember, the address object was defined before we started the learning byte to save time. But this is the prefix we want to be using, and this is the address object that we specified in that variable for the branch 1 context. And then we can see the actual firewall policy. We can see here that we're matching source address branch 1 host. So we're matching that address object there, and then we're permitting it. That's great. That's what should be happening. Let's look at the next one to see how that looks. Okay, we can see here this is different, and different is good because we want it to be different. That's the whole point of variables. We have the branch 2 host address object, the actual range, the prefix, the 10.10.12.0/24, and then we can see that we're matching on that address object and permitting it. That's great. That's exactly what we want to see. And then we can view the configuration for the HQ device. We're going to find something very similar. See HQ host. That's exactly what we want to see for the address object. See that prefix range, that 10.10.11.0/24? Perfect. And we'll see that we're matching on that address object and permitting the traffic. That's exactly what we want to see. So we push this to all 3 of those devices. They're going to get 3 different configurations. That's exactly what we want to see. Okay, so I do want to go back real quick. I want to show you what happens when we take, say we take the HQ context out. So that means that we don't have a context for the HQ, but in that policy, we are pushing that firewall rule that's using this variable to the HQ device. So keep in mind that we're using the default address of any-IPv4. So we're going to modify that. Let's jump back to firewall policies and see how that changed things. Go back to the FW var. We can see we're using that FW int-var variable. Let's go to publish again. Okay, so let's see. Did it change anything on branch 1? Shouldn't have. We'll check it out real quick. Nope, that's all the same. We're good there. No problem. Change anything on branch 2? Shouldn't, because we have that context value specified for branch 2. And again, no change here. This is exactly what we had before. Now let's check out HQ. Remember, we removed HQ from the context value. See what it does here. This is a lot different, and it should be. We don't have that specified in the context value. We don't have that address book entry. And for the match source address, we have match source address any IPv4. So keep that in mind, that any device that you don't have a context value specified for the variable object, or for a variable object, it's going to use the default value that you specified in that variable object. And with this, we specified any IPv4. We could have actually specified a different address object. We could have specified a single address. We could have specified a prefix, that was an address object. So keep that in mind. It's very flexible in that regards. Alright, so that brings us to the end of the Security Director Variable Objects Learning Byte. First, we explained the purpose of variable objects. Then we discussed how to configure variable objects. And then we discussed how to verify the use of those variable objects. And we did that through just examining what the CLI would look like inside of the GUI, inside of Security Director. We could have taken that a step further, pushed those policies to the managed devices and looked at the CLI, but that wasn't necessary. We were able to see the changes and the differences just by looking at what they would be inside of the Security Director GUI. And so again, that is the end of this learning byte, and hopefully this learning byte is helpful for you in your day-to-day work. And as always, thanks for watching.
Visit the Juniper Education Services website to learn more about courses. View our full range of classroom, online, and e-learning courses. Learning paths, industry segment and technology-specific training paths. Juniper Network's certification program, the ultimate demonstration of your competence. And the training community, from forums to social media. Join the discussion.